February 1942. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, the impenetrable fortress of the British Empire, one of the most important naval bases in the world. A city defended by Britain at the cost of millions of pounds, home to some of the most modern fortifications of its time, where a garrison of over 85,000 men was expected to withstand enemy onslaughts. A city that, according to the British command, was more impregnable than England was in 1588, when she repelled the Spanish Armada. 7 days later, the city capitulates. Not after weeks of desperate fighting, not after the garrison has exhausted its last strength. After a week of intense fighting on the island, but under conditions that made surrenders seem virtually inevitable. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commander of British forces in Singapore, approaches General Tomoyuki Yamashita with a white flag and signs an unconditional surrender. 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian soldiers surrender to a Japanese army of approximately 35,000, a force physically outnumbered 2 to 3 to 1. It was the largest capitulation in the history of the British Empire. It was the largest surrender of a naval base that was supposed to be impregnable. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, would call it the most terrible defeat ever suffered by Britain, even worse than Dunkirk in 1940, when the British Army was evacuated from the mainland under German airstrikes. How did this happen? How did a fortress designed by the finest British engineers, defended by tens of thousands of soldiers, and armed with modern weaponry of the time, fall to a numerically inferior enemy in just a few days of fighting? The answer lies not in the Japanese military capabilities, although they were considerable, but in the psychology, prejudices, and calculations of the British command. The narrative of this downfall is the story of how colonial mentality, racism, and overconfidence became weapons more lethal than any weapon. It is the story of how the British command convinced itself and its soldiers that the Japanese were incapable of complex military operations, that they couldn't fight in the tropics, that they couldn't see at night, that Asian armies were fundamentally inferior to European ones, and how these beliefs led to one of the most humiliating defeats in military history. The fall of Singapore was more than just a military defeat. It was the collapse of the myth of the British Empire. It was the collapse of the faith of millions of British Asian subjects in the steadfastness of their little British queen on the throne in London. If Singapore, Britain's most powerful fortress in Asia, could fall in a week, what could stand? If 35,000 Japanese could defeat 85,000 Britons, what was the true strength of the British Empire? The answers to these questions would shape Asian policy for the next 20 years. The city that was supposed to be a symbol of eternal strength became a monument to arrogance. A fortress once thought impregnable opened its gates to the enemy within a week, and millions of people who believed in the inviolability of the British Empire learned that empires are merely people who believe in their own superiority, and that this belief can be dispelled as quickly as smoke. In the late 1930s, Singapore was more than just a military base. It was a symbol of British power in Asia, the capital of a colonial empire in the East. After World War I, when Japan began to express imperial ambitions in the region, the British Admiralty concluded that it was necessary to create a powerful naval stronghold in Asia, capable of confronting any adversary. Singapore was chosen as a key strategic point. Situated at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, the island controlled the straits through which all trade routes in the region had to pass. From 1923 to 1938, Britain spent vast sums on fortifications on Singapore. Forts, barracks, airfields, and warehouses were built. The island was transformed into a veritable fortress, designed to be impregnable to any enemy. Enormous cannons mounted on the island's shores were aimed at the sea. It was assumed that any enemy would attack the island from the sea using warships. These cannons, it was believed, would be able to repel any naval invasion. However, there was one critical omission in this plan. When British military engineers designed Singapore's fortifications, they assumed the island would be attacked from one direction, from the sea. The guns were aimed north and northeast, where the enemy was expected to come from. But no one considered the possibility of an attack from the west or southwest, from the Malay Peninsula. This wasn't just an oversight. It was a fundamental flaw in military thinking, a mistake that stemmed from the belief that an enemy couldn't approach the island from land. In 1941, when Japan occupied French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and war became inevitable, British command in the Far East began preparing. The garrison was increased. Additional troops were sent to Singapore. Fortifications were ordered. However, no one yet believed the island could be attacked from land, from Malaya. The British command was convinced that Malaya would be defended and that Japanese forces would never be able to advance far enough south to threaten Singapore. This overconfidence was based on several beliefs that now seem not only mistaken, but also absurd. The first was that the Japanese were incompetent warriors, incapable of complex military operations. Some British officers openly derided the Japanese army, citing its character, climate, and culture, which, in their view, were unsuited to European-style warfare. The second belief was that Asian armies could not fight at night, that they needed daylight to navigate. The third belief was that the Japanese could not fight in the tropics and that the Malaya climate would be devastating for them. The fourth belief was that the Japanese Air Force, although powerful, was incapable of matching the British Air Force. It was a mixture of racism, military overconfidence, and underestimation of the enemy. As historian Ian Guy would later write, the British command suffered from a colonial malady. They were convinced that Europeans, by virtue of their race and culture, were inevitably superior to Asians in military matters. They could not imagine that an Asian nation could develop a military strategy equal or superior to that of Europe. The Singapore and Malaya garrison in December 1941 consisted of approximately 88,000 British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and local Malayan troops, distributed throughout Malaya and Singapore Island. The commander was Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, a British commander who had previously commanded forces in Palestine and had experience in colonial administration, but lacked experience in conducting large-scale operations against a well-prepared enemy. Percival relied on the advice of his officers, many of whom shared a common overconfidence in the British ability to defeat the Japanese. In contrast, the Japanese command took a completely different approach to the Malaya campaign. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Japanese commander, was an experienced military leader who understood that the European strategy of waiting for the enemy in fortified positions could be circumvented through mobility and maneuver. Yamashita devised a campaign plan that relied on maneuverability, speed, and unpredictability rather than a direct confrontation with British static defenses. Ironically, the British command had information about Japanese plans. British intelligence intercepted some Japanese communications, though not all. However, even when information about Japanese movements and plans was available, the British command often ignored it or misinterpreted it, as it didn't fit their preconceptions about Japanese capabilities. Thus, when the war began in December 1941, Britain entered the conflict with Japan strategically compromised even before a shot was fired. Its perceptions of the enemy, its own capabilities, and the very nature of war were flawed. And these errors, born of racism and colonial thinking, would cost the British Empire dearly. One of the most striking and tragic parts of the story of the fall of Singapore is how openly and cynically the British command expressed its racial prejudices against the Japanese and Asian warriors in general. These weren't just the private opinions of officers. They were the official position of the British military command, recorded in documents, circulars, and orders. These beliefs filtered down the chain of command, influencing troop training, the deployment of defensive positions, and tactical decisions. In memos from that period, later discovered in British archives, British officers wrote about the Japanese in terms that seem utterly implausible today. One wrote, "The Japanese are Asians, and Asians are biologically incapable of the complex military coordination required for modern warfare. They may be dangerous in small numbers, but mass coordination is beyond them. Another officer declared, "The Japanese soldier is nothing more than a slave, following orders. He cannot think for himself. Therefore, if we destroy a few leaders, the rest of the army will collapse." One of the most common ideas among British officers was the belief that the Japanese couldn't see at night. This idea, completely devoid of scientific basis, was widespread in the British Army. It was believed that Asian descent somehow made a person incapable of seeing in the dark, that their eyes were genetically adapted only to daylight. Based on this belief, the British command decided that the Japanese would not attack at night, and consequently, the night defense in Malaya was weakened. The Japanese, of course, were aware of this belief, perhaps through double agents or simply through obvious gaps in the night defenses, and they systematically attacked at night, taking advantage of the disorganization of the British defenders. General Percival, commander of the defense of Singapore and Malaya, was apparently a victim of this same colonial mentality. In his post-war memoirs, Percival wrote that he was astonished by the mobility and organization of the Japanese army. "I expected to encounter an army equipped with bicycles, incapable of night operations, incapable of dealing with our weapons," he wrote. However, the reality turned out to be quite different. British forces in Malaya faced an enemy that moved quickly through the jungle, avoiding fortified positions, conducted active night operations, and were often successful in doing so, demonstrated a high level of coordination and discipline, was better adapted to the tropical climate and terrain, showed a high level of motivation and readiness for self-sacrifice. However, instead of reconsidering their beliefs, the British command attempted to reconcile this new information with their old prejudices. When the Japanese advanced faster than expected, it was attributed not to the competence of Japanese commanders, but to luck or numerical superiority, even though in the initial stages of the campaign, the Japanese were often outnumbered. When the Japanese carried out successful night operations, it was attributed to insane bravery based on a complete disregard for casualties rather than tactical skill. This failure to adapt to reality had serious consequences for the British Army's combat effectiveness. Soldiers who had been pampered with the idea of their own racial superiority suddenly found themselves confronted by an enemy who didn't live up to that idea. This undermined their morale. If the enemy was supposedly incapable of night operations, yet carried them out successfully, what did that say about the reliability of the command's information? If the enemy was supposedly incapable of maneuver warfare, yet carried it out masterfully, could the command be trusted in other matters? Furthermore, colonial thinking led to an underestimation of the necessary training. Soldiers in Malaya were primarily trained in trench warfare, defending fortified positions, and fighting in familiar terrain. But they were not trained in maneuver warfare, night operations, fighting in low visibility conditions, or using artillery and mortars in a rapidly changing environment. When Japan entered the war in December 1941, it was prepared. Its commanders had developed a strategy that took into account the weaknesses of British defenses. Its army was prepared for tropical warfare, night operations, and rapid movement. Its soldiers were trained to work independently, make decisions at the lowest levels of command, and improvise when communications were disrupted. Britain, by contrast, entered the war with an army psychologically unprepared for this lie, convinced of its superiority, and trained for a type of war the Japanese had no intention of waging. And the worst part? Even when reality began to dispel these beliefs, the British command was too stubborn or too wedded to them to make the necessary adjustments. This was colonial thinking in its purest form. The conviction that Europeans were superior to Asians, that European civilization was superior to Asian ones, that a European army would inevitably defeat an Asian one. And this thinking, embodied in battle orders, assumptions, and tactical decisions, became one of the main enemies of the British Empire, no less dangerous than the Japanese with their tanks and planes. While the British command in Malaya and Singapore slept, lulled by myths of their own superiority, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, in Tokyo and later in the field, was developing a completely different campaign plan. Yamashita, a general born in 1885 in Kume Province, Japan, was one of Japan's most capable military leaders. Before being appointed commander of the expeditionary force in Malaya, Yamashita had trained in Europe, studied European military tactics, and was familiar with the organization of European armies, including the British. However, unlike the British, who believed that the technology and discipline of European armies would inevitably lead to victory, Yamashita understood that a campaign in Malaya would be different from a European war. Malaya was not the open fields of France or the plains of European Russia. It was a territory covered in dense jungle, crisscrossed by rivers, swamps, and rubber plantations. A terrain the Japanese could exploit to their advantage if they adapted to it and exploited their advantages of mobility. Yamashita's plan was revolutionary for the time. Instead of attempting to break through the British fortified positions from the front, he would outflank them, move sideways, and use minor roads, jungle trails, and river crossings. His army would not be a frontal column, but a distributed stream. Instead of being subordinated to the supply demands of a huge army moving along a single route, the Japanese would be divided into many smaller groups, each moving independently, uniting only for attacks. The Japanese corps allocated to the Malaya campaign numbered approximately 35,000, although some sources indicate a higher number, up to 50,000 with supporting troops. Britain, on the other hand, had approximately 88,000 troops distributed across Malaya and Singapore. On paper, the British had a numerical advantage, but in practice, on the ground, they were unable to exploit this advantage. The logistics of the Japanese campaign were minimalist to a degree almost unimaginable for a European army. Instead of relying on trucks for supplies, the Japanese used bicycles, tens of thousands of them, which could navigate forest trails where trucks would have stalled. Instead of relying on an organized warehouse system, the Japanese lived off the local population, confiscating food and supplies from occupied villages. This, of course, created resentment among the local population, but it also meant the Japanese could move quickly without having to wait for trucks to arrive. Discipline in the Japanese army was strict, but not in the sense of bloody terror, as often portrayed in propaganda. It was a discipline based on a system of training that taught soldiers to think independently within the framework of a grand strategy. The Japanese soldier, contrary to what the British believed, was not a simple automaton who obeyed orders without question. He was trained to wage war in conditions of poor communication and was allowed, even encouraged, to make tactical decisions at the lowest levels of command. The Japanese plan for the Malaya campaign included several key elements. First, the rapid destruction of British air power. Without air control, the British would lose the ability to support their positions from the air and obtain aerial reconnaissance. Second, a rapid advance down the Malayan Peninsula, using mobility and flanking maneuvers to outflank British defensive lines rather than smashing into them head-on. Third, reaching the Strait of Johor, separating the Malayan Peninsula from Singapore, and forcing a crossing using naval gunfire to provide fire support. Fourth, an assault on the island itself, capitalizing on the experience and morale gained by this time. Yamashita was confident of success, but he was also realistic. He knew the British had superior numbers and weapons. He knew Singapore was a fortified position, difficult to storm. But he believed that psychological factors, proper tactics, and proper use of terrain could offset the enemy's material superiority. Interestingly, after the war, in his court-martial testimony, Yamashita revealed something important. When asked whether he believed he could win the campaign in Malaya, he replied, "I believed it was possible to win if the enemy made mistakes, and I was almost certain the British would make mistakes. Europeans often fail to see what's in front of them because they expect to see something completely different." This simple quote captures the essence of the problem for the British. Yamashita didn't believe in Japanese superiority the way the British believed in theirs. He simply believed he understood the enemy correctly and that the enemy misunderstood him. And in this, he was absolutely right. On December 8, 1941, almost simultaneously with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops began landing in Thailand and the northern Malay Peninsula. This marked the beginning of a campaign that would last exactly 70 days, from the first battle to the surrender of Singapore. During these 70 days, events would occur that would forever change the history of Asia and put an end to the myth of British power in the Eastern Hemisphere. The first major blow for the British was the loss of air superiority. Britain, which had believed its air force could easily defeat the Japanese, discovered otherwise. Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighters proved themselves to be no worse, and in some ways even better, than the British Hawker Hurricane fighters defending Malaya. The Japanese Zeros were more maneuverable, had a longer range, and the pilots who flew them demonstrated a high level of training. Air bases in Malaya were destroyed within 2 or 3 days of fighting. Airfields in Kota Bharu, Ipis, Sulai, and other locations were subjected to massive Japanese air raids. British aircraft based at these airfields were either destroyed on the ground or shot down in the air. British air losses in the first days of the war in the Far East were catastrophic. In 3 days, Britain lost approximately 200 aircraft, roughly half of its air force in the Far East. But worse was yet to come. The two main symbols of British naval power in the East, the battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, were sent to the Strait of Malacca to attack the Japanese fleet and prevent the landing of Japanese troops. It was a bold, even desperate plan. The two battleships were to pass through waters controlled by Japanese aircraft, find the Japanese fleet, and destroy it. It was a mission to certain death. Early in the morning of December 10, 1941, Japanese aircraft spotted two British battleships. Over the next few hours, one of the most astonishing naval operations in history unfolded. Without fighter support, which had been destroyed several days earlier, and without adequate air defense, the two battleships were attacked by 88 Japanese torpedo bombers and bombers. The battleship's crews fought desperately, but they were helpless against the waves of Japanese aircraft. HMS Repulse was torpedoed and sunk first, around midday. HMS Prince of Wales held out longer, suffering 4 torpedoes and 2 bombs, but was eventually sunk at 5:35 p.m. local time. Both ships sank with the loss of 840 lives. This was a defeat not just in terms of the sheer number of losses, but also in its symbolism. Two of the British Empire's newest battleships, which were supposed to defend Singapore, were sunk by Japanese aircraft. And this happened in broad daylight, in full view, with virtually no assistance from British aircraft. The entire world learned that the British Navy could be defeated by air power. In London, when Churchill received news of the sinking of the two battleships, he was shocked. As he would later write in his memoirs, "I received the news of the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse on the day I was at my home in London. It was the hardest blow of the war for me. Never before had I felt so helpless." With the loss of these two ships, the entire British defense strategy for Singapore collapsed. The defense was based on the assumption that the British fleet would dominate the seas around Singapore, that it would be able to prevent a Japanese landing on the island, and that it would be able to cut off Japanese troops from supplies and reinforcements. Without this fleet, all these assumptions became invalid. The way was open for the Japanese. Meanwhile, in Malaya, Japanese troops advanced faster than the British expected. The use of bicycles allowed the Japanese to move quickly on roads. Night attacks, unexpected by the British, often resulted in the destruction of British positions. When the British took up a position and prepared to defend, they often discovered that the Japanese had already outflanked or reared it. British troops were forced to retreat, often leaving behind equipment, ammunition, and wounded. By the end of the first week of the war, it was clear the situation was unmanageable. The British Air Force was destroyed. The British Navy was decimated. The British Army in Malaya was retreating. The path to Singapore was open. And now the question was not whether the Japanese could reach Singapore, but how quickly they would do so. December 1941, January 1942. During these 2 months, the Japanese army under Yamashita advanced down the Malayan Peninsula, covering the distance from its northern border in Thailand to the Strait of Johor, separating Malaya from Singapore. This distance of approximately 700 kilometers was covered in less than 7 weeks, an average advance of over 100 kilometers per week. For troops of the time, especially for an army moving through jungle, this was an unprecedented speed. The British command in Malaya, led by General Arthur Percival and his chief of staff, Major General Beverly Norden, was completely disorganized. Intelligence was either non-existent or its reports were ignored. When scouts brought back information about the location and numbers of the Japanese, command often dismissed it, believing it to be either incorrect or exaggerated. This led to situations in which British troops found themselves encircled or flanked because they didn't expect the Japanese where they were already. One of the fundamental errors of the British command was a misjudgment of the terrain. The British assumed that the jungles of Malaya would be impassable for the army, that the Japanese would be confined to the main road. However, this assumption was incorrect. The Japanese, better prepared for maneuver warfare in rugged terrain, discovered numerous roads, trails, and waterways that allowed them to outflank British positions. The Japanese often advanced through terrain the British considered impassable. The morale of the British troops in Malaya began to decline with each passing day. Every retreat, every instance of the Japanese outflanking a position, every day without air support, all this undermined the soldiers' faith in their command. At first, the retreats were tactical. Troops retreated to new positions. But soon they became chaotic. Attacked from the flank, surrounded, or threatened with encirclement, units often fled. Officers lost control of their units. By January 1942, the British defense in Malaya had virtually collapsed. The remaining British troops retreated south towards Singapore, hoping that the island, well fortified and with a stronger garrison, would be able to withstand the Japanese advance. The decision was made to evacuate Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Selangor, and retreat. The few Japanese paratroopers who landed in Malaya captured vast territories with minimal losses. There were no pursuers. British air power, destroyed in the first days of the war, was unable to provide support. On January 31st, 1942, the remaining British, Australian, and Indian troops retreated to Singapore Island, leaving the Malay Peninsula completely under Japanese control. They followed suit, destroying the bridges and tugboats intended to prevent the Japanese from crossing the strait. However, these measures were insufficient. The Japanese had wooden boats, rafts, and other improvised means of crossing. They had no need for bridges. They could cross by almost any means. By this point, the British garrison on the island numbered approximately 80,000 men. This was a significant force. However, morale was close to collapse. Soldiers who had seen their enemy, whom they considered inferior, defeat them again and again, now had to believe they could successfully defend the fortified island. This required a level of trust in their command that no longer existed. Another problem was the island's readiness for defense. Despite the enormous expenditure on building fortifications on Singapore, the island was poorly prepared for defense from land, from the Malay Peninsula. The cannons were aimed at the sea. The defensive lines and trenches were positioned to withstand a naval attack, not a land attack. Rapid reconstruction of the fortifications was impossible. There was insufficient time, insufficient materials, and a lack of manpower. Singapore's water supply system also proved vulnerable. The island didn't produce enough of its own water and relied on pipeline imports from Malaya. When the British retreated, they attempted to destroy this pipeline to prevent its use by the Japanese. However, they were unable to completely destroy it, and the island's water supplies were limited. Already during the first battles on the island, command began to worry about fresh water supplies. The artillery on Singapore was numerous and powerful, dozens of batteries with guns of various calibers. However, most of this artillery was positioned and aimed at the northern coast, expecting an attack from the sea. When the Japanese launched an attack from the northwest, from land, the gunners discovered that their guns were aimed incorrectly. Attempts to reorient the guns took time, and the success was questionable. By February 8, 1942, when the Japanese began crossing the Strait of Johor and landing on Singapore Island, the British command was already prepared to surrender. Percival knew the island could not be held, but he still hoped to hold the line, building defensive lines, hoping to buy time. However, even this was beyond his capabilities. Morale had completely collapsed. The soldiers, who had seen their enemies defeat them again and again in Malaya, did not believe they could win here. February 8, 1942. Japanese troops crossed the Strait of Johor on a multitude of boats, rafts, and improvised vessels. The first waves of Japanese soldiers land on the northwest coast of Singapore Island, in an area where British defenses were weakest. Almost simultaneously, Japanese aircraft begin massive air raids on the city and its environs. The bombing, which had been sporadic up to this point, now becomes incessant. The city, which only a month earlier had been a symbol of imperial grandeur, is transformed into a war zone. The bombings are causing terrible damage to the city. Residential neighborhoods are burning. Ammunition depots are exploding in chain reactions. Food warehouses are destroyed. Hospitals are overflowing with the wounded. The streets are filled with refugees. Civilians who tried to take refuge from the bombs in concrete shelters, but many were killed by direct hits. One of the first things damaged by the bombing was the water supply system. Although the Japanese didn't completely destroy the pipeline from Malaya, British bombing of their own positions, attempts to disrupt communications before retreating, and general disorganization led to the destruction of many parts of the water supply system. By the end of the first days of fighting on the island, command estimated the fresh water supply at approximately 48 hours. This was a critical factor influencing the decision to surrender. Singapore's civilian population was in a panic. A city that had never seen combat on such a scale had suddenly become a front line. People scrambled to save themselves. Many tried to find ships to escape to Java or other safe havens. However, there weren't enough ships. Only those with connections, money, or good fortune fled. The rest stayed behind to endure the bombings and the invasion. The British command had lost control of the situation. Communication lines between various units were completely severed or partially damaged. General Percival was in his command center at Fort Keenan on the island, attempting to coordinate the defense. However, coordination was virtually impossible. The units he ordered to defend certain positions often failed to carry out orders or carried them out ineffectively. The Japanese forces themselves on the island did not perform ideally. In the first days of fighting, they encountered a powerful artillery counterattack from the British. The British artillery, although initially misdirected, was soon reoriented and proved to be a terrible weapon against Japanese positions. Japanese losses in the first days were significant. The second landing wave was delayed due to intense fire. However, the Japanese command demonstrated a resolve that the British lacked. Yamashita, although alarmed by the heavy losses, ordered his troops to continue the advance. He knew that if the advance stalled, British artillery could disrupt his battle formation. The order was, "Forward at any cost," and his soldiers obeyed. By the third day of fighting on the island, the garrison's condition was critical. Water supplies were dwindling. Food supplies were dwindling. Casualties were significant. The rank and file, especially the Australian and Indian troops, began to rebel against continuing the fighting. Why did they have to die for Singapore if everything had been decided in advance? Why hadn't the command planned a proper defense? Why had they found themselves in the situation they found themselves in? General Percival held a conference with his divisional commanders. Each reported the critical situation of his unit. Ammunition was running low. The wounded could not be evacuated. Positions could not be held. It was clear to the commanders that the end was near. But who was to offer surrender? In British military tradition, surrender was a disgrace. Any general who offered it would be accused of cowardice. However, the reality was that the alternative to surrender was mass refusal to obey orders. If Percival had ordered his troops to remain fearful, they might simply have refused. The troops were so demoralized that such an outcome was entirely possible. Furthermore, Percival received reports that Australian troops in some positions were preparing to retreat or surrender without orders. On the last day before the capitulation, the city's water supply was completely cut off for several hours. When it was restored, it turned out there were only enough supplies for about a day, no more. Percival, conferring with his staff, realized that further defense was impossible. Troops without water, ammunition, food, or morale were unable to fight. And the battle that ensued if he ordered his troops to continue would be nothing short of massacre. On February 15, 1942, just over a week after the fighting on the island began, General Percival decided to surrender. It wasn't a decision of desperation, but one of logic. Further resistance was impossible. Surrender, although shameful in military terms, was the only option that could save the lives of his soldiers. On February 15, 1942, at around 4:30 p.m. local time, General Arthur Percival, the Supreme Commander of British forces in Singapore, emerged from his command center with a white flag. He was accompanied by a small group of staff officers. They were heading toward Japanese positions in the sector controlled by Major General Kaiichi Imamu, commander of a Japanese division. It was one of the most humiliating moments in the history of the British Empire. A British Army general, commanding a fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, marching toward the enemy with a white flag raised. The surrender negotiations were brief. Percival and his officers met with Yamashita at Ford's Villa, which served as the Japanese command center. Yamashita, who was as surprised as the British by the speed of his own success, asked Percival one question. Why didn't you fight? It was a question that deserved an answer. Yamashita knew his army was outnumbered. He knew the British had superior weaponry and fortifications. He knew his army's losses were significant. Logically, the British should have continued to resist. Why did they surrender so quickly? Percival tried to explain. Water supplies were running low. Ammunition was running low. The troops were demoralized. Further resistance was impossible. But Yamashita listened, as if he didn't quite believe these explanations. After the war, at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Yamashita would give his own answer to this question. The reason Singapore fell wasn't because we were so strong, but because the British believed they were too strong. This belief blinded them. They didn't see what was right before their eyes. The terms of the surrender were simple: unconditional surrender. 80,000 British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and other troops surrendered to 35,000 Japanese soldiers. It was the largest surrender of the British Army in its history. Even at Dunkirk in 1940, the British Army did not surrender. It was evacuated. Here, in Singapore, it surrendered. The surrender order was issued by Percival and distributed among the troops. The soldiers were required to surrender their weapons, supplies, and positions. They were to assemble at designated locations to be registered as prisoners of war. Many soldiers wept. Some were in shock. Others were relieved. At least they wouldn't have to die anymore. But the relief was premature. The horrors of captivity lay ahead. It's interesting to note that the Japanese offensive had achieved sufficient success to justify surrender, but not yet enough to completely defeat the British Army. By some estimates, had Percival ordered continued resistance for a few more days, The Japanese would have been forced to halt their advance and regroup. Their ammunition supplies were also running low. In a sense, the surrender occurred at a time when both sides were on the brink of collapse. However, this assumption is based on the assumption that Percival's troops would have been able to continue the resistance. First, there was the issue of morale. How could demoralized troops be ordered to continue resistance when they had already lost faith in their command? Second, there was the issue of water. Without it, the troops could not function. Third, there was the issue of the civilian population. The city was full of refugees and wounded who needed water, food, and medical care. After the war, veterans and historians questioned whether the surrender order was correct. Some argued that Percival could have continued resistance to inflict more casualties on the Japanese, slow their advance, and give other Allied forces time to arrive. Others argued that the surrender was inevitable and that it saved lives. Percival would later write in his memoirs, "I hesitated for a long time before deciding to surrender, but I understood that the choice was not between an honorable death in battle and a dishonorable capitulation. The choice was between surrender and the mass death of civilians from hunger and thirst. I chose surrender because I believed it was the right thing for a commander to do. However, whether the surrender order was correct or not, the consequences were the same. Singapore fell. The British Empire collapsed in the eyes of millions of Asians, and the world learned that a European army could be defeated by an Asian army, not through technical or numerical superiority, but through tactical skill, mobility, and determination." After the signing of the Instrument of Surrender, 80,000 prisoners of war were gathered in various locations on Singapore Island and began their journey to Japanese custody. The first weeks of captivity were relatively bearable, but the situation soon deteriorated. The Japanese, unprepared to manage such a huge number of prisoners, faced supply problems. The prisoners were housed in various locations: sports fields, schools, and military barracks. Conditions were appalling: overcrowding, poor sanitation, and a shortage of food and clean water. However, an even more terrible fate awaited many of them later. In October 1942, the so-called Death Railway began. The forced labor of British, Australian, Dutch, and other prisoners of war on the construction of the Thailand-Burma Railway. It was one of the deadliest engineering projects of World War II. Approximately 60,000 prisoners were sent to this work. About 13,000 of them died, not in combat, but from disease, exhaustion, abuse, and poor conditions. Winston Churchill, upon receiving news of Singapore's capitulation, was alarmed not only by the military defeat, but also by the political consequences. As he wrote in his memoirs, "The day of Singapore's surrender was one of the darkest days in the history of the British Empire. It was more than a military failure. It was the collapse of the entire myth of British power in Asia." The fall of Singapore had enormous political significance. For a century, Britain had dominated Asia, and few believed this dominance could ever end. But the fall of Singapore demonstrated that Britain was not omnipotent, that its army could be defeated, that its fortified positions could be captured. This moment marked the beginning of the end of the British Empire in Asia. Although Britain still controlled India and other territories, its authority was lost forever. In India, the fall of Singapore had a profound political impact. The Indian national movement, which had already been demanding independence, now had a new argument. If Britain couldn't even defend its own position in Asia, how could it defend India? Indian politicians and public figures pointed to the fall of Singapore as proof that the British Empire was in decline and that the time had come for Asian nations to take their destiny into their own hands. For ordinary Britons, the fall of Singapore was a shock. Singapore was a symbol of Britain, a place that seemed as strong and invulnerable as England itself. That it fell within weeks was a psychological blow. Newspapers tried to explain the disaster, but explanations were few. How could such a fortress fall? Where was British valor? Churchill's government attempted to control the narrative. Official reports claimed Singapore was captured thanks to the Japanese's numerical superiority, the surprise attack, and air superiority. These explanations weren't false, but they were incomplete. They didn't explain why the British were unprepared, why their defensive plans were so flawed, or why their commanders underestimated the enemy. After the war, the truth began to emerge. Books, memoirs, and documents revealed that the fall of Singapore was not simply the result of Japanese military skill, but also the result of British unpreparedness, poor command, and racial prejudice. Churchill, in his post-war memoirs, acknowledged some of these problems, but also tried to defend his reputation by pointing to the resource limitations and challenges Britain faced at the start of the war. One of the consequences of the fall of Singapore was Percival's dismissal from command. Although he was released as a prisoner of war after the war, his rank in the British Army never recovered. He was transferred to less important positions and retired in 1951. History remembers him as the general who surrendered one of the British Empire's greatest fortresses. However, over time, the historical view of Percival has become somewhat more balanced. Many historians acknowledge that Percival was not the worst commander, but he faced a virtually impossible situation. His staff was unprepared, his troops were demoralized, his supplies were depleted. The choice between surrender and senseless slaughter was a choice that many historians believe he made correctly. Nevertheless, the fall of Singapore remains in history as a symbol of the end of an era when Europe dominated Asia without question, an era when Asian peoples were convinced of their own inferiority, an era when European civilization was considered superior and Asian civilization inferior. After Singapore, that era ended. Asia awakened. The fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, was more than just a military defeat. It was the moment when the collapse of the British Empire in Asia became inevitable. Winston Churchill would later call it the most terrible defeat that Britain has ever suffered. And he was right. Not because the losses were greater than elsewhere, but because its symbolic significance was enormous. Over the next 5 years after the fall of Singapore, events in Asia unfolded with unmistakable logic. After the war, as Britain attempted to reassert control over Asia, it faced intensifying independence movements. In India, Malaya, Burma, Hong Kong, everywhere, Asian peoples began demanding independence. And Britain, exhausted by the war and no longer possessing the resources or political will to maintain its empire through military force, was forced to agree. By 1950, Britain had lost most of its Asian colonies. By the late 1960s, the British Empire in Asia had virtually disappeared. The fall of Singapore also had a profound impact on Asian worldviews. For centuries, Asian peoples had been convinced of European superiority. Europeans were a master race who could dominate Asians simply by virtue of their origins. But the fall of Singapore demonstrated that this was not the case. If Asians could defeat Europeans on the battlefield, what else was untrue about the European narrative? If the Japanese could win, why couldn't other Asian nations win too? It was a revolution in the psychology and self-perception of Asian peoples. General Yamashita, of course, never imagined that his campaign in Malaya would have such far-reaching consequences. For him, it was simply a military operation, part of a larger plan for Japanese expansion in Asia. However, historically, his campaign became a turning point, the moment when Asian history diverged from the trajectory determined by the European colonial system. After Singapore, Asia would never be the same again. What lessons can be learned from the fall of Singapore? The first concerns the dangers of overconfidence. The British command was so convinced of its own superiority that it blinded them. They didn't see the enemy as they really were. They saw the enemy as they wanted them to be: weak, incapable, inferior. This overconfidence became a more dangerous enemy than the Japanese themselves. The second lesson concerns the importance of proper preparation and planning. Singapore was fortified to withstand a seaborne attack. No one considered the possibility of a land attack. This was a fundamental error in military planning. It's not enough to defend one direction. You need to defend all directions, and you need to be prepared for an attack from an unexpected direction. The third lesson concerns morale. An army with good morale can fight against great odds. An army with poor morale will surrender in the face of obstacles it could potentially overcome. The morale of the Singapore garrison collapsed because they lost faith in their command. And when faith in their command is lost, all that remains is reports and capitulation. The fourth lesson concerns underestimating the enemy. The British considered the Japanese inferior. This was a categorical mistake. An underestimated enemy becomes especially dangerous because you are unprepared for its true capabilities. Had the British correctly assessed the Japanese, they could have prepared better. The fifth lesson concerns logistics and supply. Singapore fell, in part, because its water supplies were exhausted. Critical resources must be protected and supplied. The supply system must be redundant so that it can continue to function even if partially destroyed. The sixth lesson concerns the psychological preparation of troops. Soldiers who believe in their own superiority can often accomplish the impossible. But if this belief is shattered, they often quickly give up. The role of command is not only to issue tactical orders, but also to maintain the psychological state of the troops, monitor their morale, prepare them for possible defeat, and show them the path to victory, even when it seems distant. After the war, Singapore was rebuilt. In 1959, it gained self-government, and in 1965, it became a fully independent state. Today, Singapore is one of the most developed and prosperous city-states in the world. But it will never forget the days of February 1942, when the British Empire collapsed in a matter of weeks, and when Asian history took a new course. Fortresses fall not from the enemy's strength, but from the conviction that the enemy is too weak to defeat. Singapore was fortified, armed, and numerically superior. But it fell because its defenders believed they could not be defeated. This belief was their downfall. And when faith falls, everything else falls with it. Sometimes the greatest catastrophes occur not because we face an insurmountable enemy, but because we confront the truth about ourselves, a truth we've been refusing to see. The fall of Singapore was the moment Britain confronted this truth, and that encounter marked the end of an era.